Class, the world watched in horror at what was happening in Alabama and the South by 1963. In an effort to combat Jim Crow laws, several grassroots movements and national organizations began to work together. People often refer to themselves as foot soldiers, and indeed, it will take an army of people to make a change. By 1963, Birmingham was the epicenter for racial inequality. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth recalled President Kennedy saying in June of 1963, when he had invited black leaders to meet with him, Kennedy said, "But for Birmingham, we would not be here today." Birmingham was well known for the violent white-on-black crime and bombings that occurred in the 1950s and 60s, resulting in the city's nickname of Bombingham. What is less well known about Birmingham's racial history is the extent to which early city planning decisions influenced and prompted the city's civil rights protest. According to Martin Luther King Jr., Birmingham was the most segregated city in America. It was a boiling pot class of oppression, and in 1963 it boils over. In April of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. helped launch a series of nonviolent demonstrations in Birmingham. And who was the police commissioner then? Eugene Bull Connor. He was a staunch racist, a segregationist. He didn't like these marches and civil rights movement, and he ordered the arrest of demonstrators and used any means necessary to end the protest. He will eventually use attack dogs, tear gas, electric cattle prods, and fire hoses on the demonstrators, including children. King was arrested and wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, which he had snuck out on toilet paper, written to 8 white religious leaders he felt should be doing more to help the blacks' cause. And it's a powerful letter, and I've pulled in a copy for you in the chapter module for you to read later. King said this: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." By May of 1963, with most of the adult protesters in jail or silenced, children began to march in their place in Birmingham, Alabama. They left school and marched in the streets and parks of downtown Birmingham. Bull Connor used police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses to put down the children and their demonstrations. Nearly 1,000 young people were arrested, and the violence was broadcast on television to the nation and the world. The world, not just the country, was in horror over what had happened in Birmingham. George Wallace, our governor, must share the blame for the events in 1963. At his inaugural address in January of 1963, he declared his position as an ardent segregationist and fully supported massive resistance. In his speech in January, he declared, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." It's hard to listen to, class, but I want you to see it for yourself.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Now, this really becomes a rally cry for massive resistance in Alabama. And it didn't help when Wallace stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama in June of 1963 to prevent the court-ordered enrollment of several black students. Again, federal marshals had to come to Alabama to make Wallace give way. That same night that Wallace barred the door at the UA, at the University of Alabama, That same night, NAACP official Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi. The South was at war, class. And I personally feel that the September bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham shifted the tide for the civil rights movement. First of all, prior to this time of the bombing at the church, Birmingham was in sort of a news blackout. Many local citizens did not know what was going on in their own community. Newspapers put protest on the second page of the paper and labeled blacks rabble-rousers and unruly mobs. Local TV stations rarely mentioned any of the protest. When I was going through graduate school, I wrote about Birmingham Jewish women and their work during the civil rights movement. And I interviewed several Jewish women and learned how they faced down the KKK to work for social justice and reform during the time. And I knew my mother-in-law worked in downtown Birmingham during the 50s and 60s, so I decided to ask her what she could tell me about the civil rights movement and, what was going on in downtown Birmingham at the time. And she said, "Kay, I don't know what you're talking about." So I mentioned a few things in particular, and she said she never knew one thing was going on during this time. Many people were like her, class. But after the bombing of the church where 4 beautiful little girls died, national news groups came in the city and began reporting regularly about the events in Birmingham. It really inspired a new wave of activism. We just couldn't keep it a secret anymore what was happening here. The high tide of the civil rights movement occurred in August of 1963, when more than 200,000 Americans of all races celebrated the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation by joining the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Key civil rights figures led the march. The most memorable moment came when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The next year, groundbreaking legislation that changes everything for the civil rights movement will be passed. I'll be talking about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the next lectures coming up. There are many more battles to come, but again, the tide is changing for the better for the civil rights movement. Now, remember the young white girl screaming at the young black girl who attempted to attend school in Arkansas I showed you earlier. Elizabeth and Hazel actually met up later in life and started a dialogue about what happened to them during the time. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure they maintained an ongoing friendship, but conversation is good, I think. Class, I'm going to leave you with King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I think his words are still just as important today, don't you? As usual, class, keep in touch.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day
in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty.